The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Colorado Territory, 1875, as Penelope Fairchild dropped to her knees beside her husband's body, crimson blood seeping into the parched earth beneath them. The stagecoach robbery that had started as a routine holdup had ended in tragedy, leaving her a widow at 26, alone and terrified in a land that showed no mercy to the weak. 3 months later, Penelope stared at her reflection in a cracked piece of looking glass propped against the mud wall of her tiny shack. Her once vibrant auburn hair hung limply around hollow cheeks, and her green eyes had lost their sparkle. The makeshift home she'd built with her own hands after burying Samuel stood as a testament to her determination to survive, but little else. Mud walls, a leaky roof of salvaged planks, and a dirt floor, this was all she had left of her dreams of a new life in the West. "Keep breathing," she whispered to herself, a daily ritual that sometimes felt like the only thing keeping her upright. Just keep breathing. The small plot of land Samuel had purchased before his death was good enough fertile soil near a creek that hadn't dried up despite the summer heat. But Penelope knew nothing about farming or ranching or any of the 100 skills needed to survive out here. The small garden she'd planted was withering from neglect and her inexperience. Their savings would last another month, maybe 2 if she was careful. A knock at her door, more a piece of wood propped against an opening, startled her. Visitors were rare this far from town. "Mrs. Fairchild," a deep voice called. "It's Sheriff Miller. Checking on you, madam." Penelope quickly smoothed her dress and hair before pulling the wood plank aside. Sheriff Miller stood awkwardly, hat in hand. Behind him was a tall man she didn't recognize, his face partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. "Good afternoon, Sheriff," she said, forcing a smile. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Just making sure you're getting on all right," Miller said, though his eyes darted around nervously, taking in the sad state of her dwelling. "And well, to introduce someone. This here's Jackson Cole. He's looking for work in these parts, and I mentioned you might need some help with this place." The stranger stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal sun-weathered features and the kindest blue eyes Penelope had ever seen. He wasn't young, perhaps 35, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. His expression was solemn, respectful. "Madam," he said with a slight nod. "Sheriff mentioned your situation. I'm real sorry about your husband." Something about his straightforward manner put her at ease despite her usual wariness of strangers. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. But I'm afraid I don't have the means to hire help." "Wasn't looking to be hired exactly," Jackson said. "More of an arrangement. I need a place to stay while I get my bearings, and you need someone who knows how to work the land. I could help in exchange for a corner to sleep in and whatever food you can spare." Penelope hesitated. Having a strange man stay on her property went against everything proper society had taught her, but proper society wouldn't keep her alive through the coming winter. "You vouch for him, Sheriff?" she asked. Sheriff Miller nodded. "Known Jackson since we were boys back in Missouri. He's a good man, Mrs. Fairchild. Served in the war, then worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas. Knows his way around a ranch." Penelope studied the man before her. His clothes were worn but clean, his gaze steady and honest. The calluses on his hands spoke of years of hard work. "There's a lean-to against the back of the shack," she finally said. "It's not much, but it would keep the rain off." "That's all I need, madam," Jackson replied. And so began an uneasy partnership. Jackson slept in the lean-to, rising before dawn each day to repair her garden, mend her fences, and hunt for fresh meat. He spoke little but worked tirelessly, and Penelope found herself watching him from the corner of her eye as she went about her own chores. A week passed, then 2. The garden began to flourish under his care, and somehow the shack seemed less dreary with his quiet presence nearby. Still, they maintained a careful distance, their conversations limited to practical matters. One evening, as Penelope was cooking a rabbit stew with vegetables from their garden, Jackson returned from town with supplies. He'd taken some pelts to sell and had brought back flour, coffee, and sugar luxuries she hadn't enjoyed in months. "You didn't have to do that," she said as he set the packages on her rickety table. "Wanted to," he replied simply. Then, almost hesitantly, he added, "Also got you these." From his saddlebag, he produced a small packet of flower seeds and a worn book. Penelope's fingers trembled as she took the gifts. The book was a collection of poems by Tennyson. "How did you know I liked to read?" Jackson shrugged, a faint color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Noticed you had that Bible all worn at the edges. Figured you might like something new." That night, she read by the light of the fire, occasionally glancing up to find Jackson watching her, a small smile playing at his lips before he quickly looked away. The next day, Penelope awoke to the sound of hammering. She stepped outside to find Jackson measuring and cutting wood he'd brought back from town. "What are you doing?" she asked, shielding her eyes from the morning sun. "This shack won't make it through winter," he said matter-of-factly. "Thought I'd start on something more substantial." "I can't afford to build a proper house," she protested. Jackson paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "The Collins place up north was abandoned after the old man died last spring, their barns still standing with plenty of good timber. Sheriff said no one would mind if we salvaged some of it. If you're willing," he said, "could use the help." That afternoon found them at the abandoned Collins homestead, Penelope holding boards steady while Jackson pulled nails carefully to preserve both the nail and the wood. It was hard, dirty work, but for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt a sense of purpose. "Were you always a cowboy?" she asked as they loaded the wagon. Jackson chuckled. "Started as one, drove cattle from San Antonio to Abilene more times than I can count. But I've done a bit of everything since then. Worked mines in Nevada, logged in Oregon, even tried my hand at shopkeeping in California. What brings you to Colorado?" He was silent for so long that Penelope thought he hadn't heard her. Finally, he said, "Running, I suppose, from memories." She didn't press him further, recognizing the pain behind his words. Everyone in the West carried ghosts. Over the next few weeks, a structure began to take shape on Penelope's land. It wasn't large, just one main room with a small bedroom off to the side, but Jackson built with care, making sure each joint was tight, each nail secure. "Never built a house before," he admitted one evening as they sat outside, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "But I've slept in enough bad ones to know what not to do," Penelope laughed, the sound surprising them both. "I think you're doing a fine job, Mr. Cole." "Jackson," he corrected gently. "After all this time working together, I think we can use first names, don't you, Mrs. Fairchild?" "Penelope," she offered, and something shifted between them, a small but significant step across the careful boundary they'd maintained. The following Sunday, Jackson disappeared for the entire day without explanation. When he returned at dusk, his wagon was loaded with furniture: a simple bed frame, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair, and a chest of drawers. "Where did you get all this?" Penelope gasped. "Made a deal with the cabinet maker in town," Jackson explained. "Helped him cut and haul timber for a week. He owed me a favor." That night, Penelope couldn't sleep. The walls of her shack felt more confining than ever as her mind raced with questions. Why was this man doing so much for her? What did he want in return? Men didn't just build houses for strangers out of kindness. As if sensing her doubts, Jackson approached her the next morning as she was feeding the chickens he'd bartered for from a neighboring farm. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," he said without preamble. "If you want me to go once the house is finished, I will." Penelope studied his face, searching for deceit but finding only sincerity. "Why are you helping me?" Jackson leaned against the fence post, his gaze distant. "When I came back from the war, I was lost. Didn't know how to live in peace anymore. An old couple took me in, gave me work, a place to stay, never asked for anything in return." He looked at her directly. "Sometimes people just need a hand up. That's all I'm trying to do." "And what happens after?" she asked, the question hanging between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. "That's for you to decide," he said softly. As autumn arrived, painting the surrounding hills in vibrant reds and golds, the house neared completion. Jackson had insisted on doing things right: a proper stone fireplace, tight-fitting windows, a solid door with a lock. When he installed glass window panes, an unimaginable luxury, Penelope couldn't hold back her tears. "It's too much," she whispered. "I can never repay you." "Not asking for repayment," Jackson said, gently wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch, brief as it was, sent a jolt through Penelope that both frightened and thrilled her. That evening, a sudden storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind howled around the shack, finding every crack and crevice while rain pounded the makeshift roof. Penelope huddled beneath her blanket, listening to the alarming creaks and groans of the structure. A particularly violent gust tore part of the roof away, sending rain pouring in. She scrambled to save her few possessions, but the dirt floor quickly turned to mud beneath her feet. "Penelope," Jackson's voice called from outside. He appeared in the doorway, drenched and wild-eyed. "You need to come to the new house. This one's not safe." Without waiting for her response, he gathered her few important belongings into a sack and took her arm. They ran through the downpour to the nearly completed house, where Jackson had been sleeping for the past few nights. Inside, a fire burned in the fireplace, casting warm light across the wooden floors. The roof, solid and well-built, kept out the rain entirely, the sound reduced to a soothing patter rather than the threatening deluge it had been in the shack. "You're soaked," Jackson observed, handing her a blanket. "I'll step outside while you change." "No," Penelope said quickly, surprising herself. "I mean, it's pouring. Just turn around." She changed quickly into her nightdress, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders afterward. "You can look now." When Jackson turned, something in his gaze made her breath catch. He quickly looked away, busying himself with stoking the fire. "You should take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." Penelope sank onto the edge of the bed, her bed in her house. It felt surreal. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for tonight, but for everything." Jackson nodded, his profile illuminated by the fire. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll see what's left of the shack." In the morning, they found the mud structure had partially collapsed under the force of the storm. Penelope stared at the ruins, feeling strangely detached. That pitiful shelter had represented her desperate attempt to survive on her own, but now it seemed like a relic from another life. "Well," she said, turning to Jackson, who stood beside her, "I suppose I've officially moved." He smiled, the rare full smile that transformed his face and made her heart skip a beat. "Housewarming present," he said, offering her a small wooden box he'd pulled from his pocket. Inside was a key, simple, iron, but perfectly fitted to the lock on her new front door. "Every home needs a key," he explained. "So you can lock out the world when you need to." Impulsively, Penelope reached up and kissed his cheek. "Thank you." Jackson froze, his eyes widening slightly before he regained his composure. "You're welcome," he murmured, his voice rougher than usual. The completed house quickly became a home. Penelope hung curtains she'd sewn from fabric Jackson had brought from town. She arranged the furniture, planted the flower seeds along the front path, and began baking bread in the new oven Jackson had built into the fireplace. With the house finished, Penelope worried that Jackson would leave as he'd suggested he might. Instead, he built himself a small cabin a respectful distance from the main house, using leftover materials and some additional timber he'd salvaged. "Thought I might stay on through winter if you're agreeable," he said as they sat on her porch one evening, watching the first snow dust the distant peaks. "Get a head start on spring planting. Maybe put in some fruit trees." "I'd like that," Penelope said, suddenly unable to imagine the homestead without him. As winter settled over the land, they fell into a comfortable routine. Jackson would rise first, breaking ice on the water barrel and starting fires in both houses. They would work separately during the day, he tending to the animals and making repairs, she cooking and sewing and planning the spring garden. In the evenings, they would often share dinner, talking late into the night. Penelope learned that Jackson had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, that he'd fought for the Union during the war, that he had a younger sister living in St. Louis whom he wrote to occasionally. He spoke little of the war years, but sometimes she would catch him staring into the distance, his expression haunted. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Boston, her whirlwind courtship with Samuel, their decision to seek fortune in the West. She found she could now speak of Samuel without the crushing grief that had once accompanied his memory. "He would have liked you," she told Jackson one snowy evening as they sat by the fire. Samuel always valued honest, hard-working men. Jackson studied her face in the firelight. "Tell me about him." And so she did, sharing memories she'd kept locked away. How Samuel would sing off-key while shaving, how he'd insisted on reading aloud to her each night, how his enthusiasm for their future had been infectious, even when their circumstances were dire. "You loved him very much," Jackson observed quietly when she finished. "I did," she acknowledged. "But I'm beginning to understand that life continues even after such a loss, that perhaps there can be new beginnings." The look they shared held possibilities neither was ready to voice. Christmas approached, bringing with it a deep cold that kept them largely housebound. 3 days before the holiday, Jackson announced he needed to go to town for supplies. "The weather's breaking tomorrow," he said. "I should be back by nightfall." But when tomorrow came and went with no sign of him, Penelope began to worry. By the second day, her concern had grown to fear. Had he finally decided to move on without saying goodbye, or had something happened to him on the treacherous winter roads? On the third day, Christmas Eve, she was about to saddle her horse and go looking for him when she heard the distant sound of wagon wheels. She ran outside, not bothering with a coat, to see Jackson's wagon cresting the hill, moving slowly through the fresh snow. "Jackson," she called, rushing toward him as he pulled the horses to a stop. "I was worried sick," he climbed down stiffly, his expression apologetic. "Got delayed by the weather. Road was worse than I expected. I'm sorry to have concerned you." Only then did Penelope notice he was favoring his right leg. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he insisted. "Slipped on some ice in town, just a bruise." But later, as they unloaded the supplies, she caught him wincing. "Let me look at it," she demanded. Reluctantly, he rolled up his pant leg to reveal an angry purple bruise spreading across his calf. Penelope gasped. "That's not just a bruise. You need to rest." Despite his protests, she insisted he stay in the main house that night so she could tend to his injury. As they sat before the fire, his leg propped up on a stool, Penelope noticed a small wrapped package among the supplies. "What's that?" she asked. Jackson looked embarrassed. "It's for you, for Christmas. That's why I was so determined to get to town." Penelope carefully unwrapped the package to find a beautiful leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "You mentioned once that you used to keep a diary," Jackson explained. "Thought you might want to start again." Penelope ran her fingers over the soft leather, deeply touched. "It's perfect," she whispered, "but I don't have anything for you." Jackson's eyes met hers. "You've given me more than you know, Penelope." Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had been building for months. Penelope found herself moving closer to him on the small sofa they shared. "Jackson," she said softly, "why did you really stay?" He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "Because from the moment I saw you standing in that doorway, trying so hard to be brave despite everything, I couldn't imagine being anywhere else." Penelope placed her hand on his. "I'm glad you stayed." Their first kiss was tentative, gentle, a question rather than a demand. When they parted, Jackson's expression was one of wonder. "I never expected this," he confessed. "Never thought I'd find someone who made me want to put down roots again." "Is that what you want?" she asked. "Roots." "With you, yes." They spent Christmas Day together, sharing a modest but joyful meal. As evening fell, Jackson surprised her by producing a sprig of mistletoe he'd brought from town. "Might be a bit forward," he said with a grin, "but I'm told it's tradition." Penelope laughed as he held it above their heads. "Far be it from me to break with tradition," she said before rising on her tiptoes to kiss him. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came new beginnings. Jackson's proposal came on a warm April evening as they planted the orchard he'd promised apple, peach, and cherry trees that would take years to bear fruit. "I'd like to be here to see these trees grow," he said, taking her hands in his. "To build more rooms onto the house as we need them. To grow old watching sunsets from that porch." Tears filled Penelope's eyes as she squeezed his hands. "Is this a proposal, Jackson Cole?" "The worst one in history, probably," he admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. "But yes, Penelope Fairchild, I'm asking if you'll marry me." "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." They were married in May, a small ceremony in town with Sheriff Miller and a few neighbors as witnesses. That night, as they stood outside their home, no longer just hers, but theirs, Penelope looked up at the stars scattered across the vast Colorado sky. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked. "When you first came here?" Jackson wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. "No," he admitted. "I was just looking for work, a place to stay for a while. I never expected to find home." "Home," Penelope repeated, leaning back against him. "That's what you built here, not just timber and nails, but a real home." "We built it together," he corrected gently. "I may have put up the walls, but you made it a home." As summer bloomed around them, so did their love. They worked side by side, expanding the garden, adding a barn, planning for the future. Word of Jackson's carpentry skills spread, bringing occasional work from neighboring homesteads. Penelope began selling excess vegetables and preserves in town, establishing their homestead as a viable, if modest, success. One evening in late August, as they sat on their porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Penelope took Jackson's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I have news," she said, her voice trembling with joy. Jackson's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "A baby, are you certain?" She nodded, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "Dr. Harper confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We'll be 3 by spring." Jackson pulled her into his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I never thought I'd have a family of my own," he whispered. "After everything I've seen, everything I've done, I didn't think I deserved one." "You deserve every happiness," Penelope insisted, framing his face with her hands. "You rebuilt more than just a house, Jackson. You rebuilt my life, our life." That winter was the happiest of Penelope's life. As snow blanketed their land, and her body changed with the growing life inside her, she and Jackson spent long evenings planning and dreaming. He built a cradle from the same timber as their house, carving intricate designs of leaves and vines along its edges. "So our child will always be connected to this place," he explained as he sanded the wood to satin smoothness. Spring brought renewal and the cry of their daughter, Emma Rose Cole, born on a perfect April morning with wildflowers blooming across the hills. Jackson held his daughter with trembling hands, all written across his weathered features. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the wisp of auburn hair that matched her mother's. "Absolutely perfect." As Emma grew, so did their homestead. Jackson built the additions he'd promised: a larger kitchen for Penelope, a nursery for Emma, a proper workshop for himself. Their orchard began to bear fruit, their cattle herd increased, and their reputation for fair dealing and hard work spread throughout the territory. 2 years after Emma's birth, their son Samuel Jackson Cole joined the family, named for both the husband Penelope had lost and the man who had restored her faith in love and life. On the 5th anniversary of the day Jackson had first arrived at her mud shack, Penelope found him sitting on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked, settling beside him. "If Sheriff Miller hadn't brought you to my door that day," Jackson took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band he'd placed there years before. "Sometimes, I was just passing through, had no intention of staying more than a few weeks. What changed your mind?" He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "You did. Your strength, your determination. The way you refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless." Penelope leaned against his shoulder, watching as Emma showed her little brother how to build a castle from sticks and stones. "I was at the end of my rope when you arrived. I don't know if I would have survived that winter alone." "You would have," Jackson said with absolute certainty. "That's what I admired from the start, but I'm glad you didn't have to." As twilight descended over their land that now supported orchards, fields, and gardens, a proper barn and stable, and the house that had started it all, Penelope reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate widow in a mud shack to the mistress of a thriving homestead, from crushing loneliness to the warm embrace of family. "Thank you," she said softly, "for building me more than just a house." Jackson's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay." Their lips met in a kiss that held the promise of all the years to come, years that would bring more children, challenges, and joys, but always, always love. Love as solid and enduring as the timber frame of the house that stood as testament to one man's belief that everyone deserved a second chance at happiness, and one woman's courage to accept it.